It's alive.
Okay. Woo. That's a good sign. Okay, good. The technology side, that's down. So everything else now is just all of my personality and my knowledge. This whole podcast has a very high charisma modifier. So hi everyone, my name is Jodie Russell. I'm a fourth year PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. I work in philosophy mostly, and I'm also a predominantly a D&D player and also an occasional DM. So I'm going to mostly be talking to you today about like my experiences of being a player and playing Dungeons and Dragons and trying to apply some of kind of like my philosophical thought on some of my experiences. So what you'll notice, like first of all, is this is very severely under-researched. This is kind of like a preliminary, some thoughts and feelings I've been having and trying to apply some of my philosophical knowledge to them. So I'd be interested to hear what you think. Whether you feel kind of like particularly compelled by the premise of the things I've been thinking about. If it's not convincing, what can I do to kind of like maybe reframe a potential project and any other input that you all might have. I think you'll see there's a lot of like overlap with the previous two talks that we've just had. So nothing kind of like too new or too scary kind of going on. So to kind of give you an idea of what I want to kind of talk about, I think that there's something particularly special about role-playing games that make it beneficial for someone's mental health. So I should caveat that I study mostly philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychiatry, and a smattering of phenomenology as well. So I'm interested in the lived experience of like what it's like to have a mental illness or what it's like to experience periods of disorder, and that also kind of quite complements a question of what is like good for one's mental health. How do we create experiences that people find positive, that people want to kind of like maintain? So I think there's something special in terms of like how we interact with role-playing games that's like different from other kinds of media, such as like video games and books and movies. This may be a little bit contentious. I'll be excited to see if you agree that there's something special about role-playing in particular, or I think it's actually generalizable. And my suspicion or my suggestion is I think that it has this kind of like quality to help us have these kind of like mental health benefits because of the way that norms are implemented in role playing. And I think they're kind of sufficiently open such that we are able to learn things about ourselves. And I'm kind of understanding self-knowledge is translating to greater agency in real life. So there are kind of like benefits in world where we learn things about ourselves through this like fantasy setting, and that can kind of like translate or be kind of like imported into like our everyday lives to have an expanded sense of agency. And that's kind of like where the benefits are. So I actually kind of like started thinking about what are the potential benefits of playing D&D during the pandemic. So I started playing D&D during the pandemic as a point to meet new people and to kind of like have this like regular social contact. So I actually started playing with 4 random men that I met online. And as a woman, that was like in hindsight not a good idea. But it just turns out that they were the 4 loveliest men I've ever met. And we definitely kind of like built this relationship over the year and a half that we were playing. So we played a Curse of Strahd campaign, which is very dark, very kind of gritty, lots of very dark and very kind of like upsetting themes. Which again, like, you know, playing with 4 men, maybe not necessarily a good idea, but the atmosphere and the collaboratory kind of like process became such a supportive group, such that, you know, 1 or 2 of us would be having kind of like a bad time, and we would take that as a moment in game to just check in with each other. And it's in that sense, it was a really special and informative first experience of playing D&D, and that was my first ever experience. So then my academic interest kind of like started to kick in when I saw articles like this one in The Guardian. And I was like, oh, actually, it's not just like me having these positive benefits, like other people also experiencing the positive benefits of playing D&D during the pandemic as well. And so then these kind of like questions start to arise for me as a philosopher, I'm like, okay, why is that? What is special about that? What's happening? What's going on there behind the scenes? And I think there's a couple of things. There's this nice quote here by Shadia Hancock, who's a founder of an advocacy group called Autism Actually, and they are also a dungeon master for neurodiverse players. And in this quote, I think there's like a couple of interesting things that can be pulled out. So this idea of like creating a sense of community, but also kind of like negotiating player expectations. I think particularly this idea of expectations is going to become kind of relevant, I think, for what I think the answer is to why role playing is so special. And yeah, the fact that they had something that they shared in common, a love for gaming, but they all wanted something different. So that's the kinds of thing you're having to negotiate as a DM, but also like as a player coming into contact with other players, you've got different interests and different values going on that could potentially come into conflict. And yet, for a lot of us, we're able to kind of like synchronize and come together, and that's what's allowing us to kind of like benefit from the nature of role playing in Dungeons and Dragons. So then the question is like, how does that work? What is that? What's going on there? So I think in order to kind of get this argument off the ground, I want to say that role playing is importantly different and special and unique. And this is maybe the kind of like contentious premise. And I think it is importantly different from playing video games or reading books or consuming movies together, in that unlike other forms of media, players have the capacity to co-construct the world. Um, Obviously, this really depends on what kind of DM you have. We have DMs that like to funnel their players more into a specific kind of like narrative or a specific structure, and you have DMs who will treat their world like an open world, and you can go anywhere. If you want to look at that flower over there, you can go over there and force your DM to describe in excruciating detail what that flower looks like. To a certain extent, there are kind of like limits to that, but I think there's something that's maybe more open than, say, video games, where we're kind of beholden to, say, like the developers or the writers in terms of like where that narrative and that story goes. There is the potential to break the game if we want to, and that doesn't necessarily undermine the medium. So you can use a spell in a creative or interesting way and push the bounds of what that spell can do. And that may really challenge your DM, and they may hate you for that. But it doesn't. The role playing structure doesn't necessarily collapse. And I think that's different from when we find aspects where we can push the limits of a video game, such as like if we uncover like bugs, or we're able to kind of like clip through walls like speedrunners do, in order to kind of like achieve those kind of like feats in gaming, where you like get through an area quickly. That seems to kind of like undermine the structure of the game itself, and exploits issues in the game itself in order to do something. Whereas I feel like in D&D there's a way to kind of like push the bounds and break it, but the role playing aspect can still stay intact to some extent. And so then what I'm kind of concluding from this is I think role playing provides a unique opportunity to gain self understanding. So I'm going to say a little bit about what I think self understanding is and how that translates to benefits for one's mental health. So this is a little bit of a side for me to nerd out to talk about the characters that I've played, because I all have your attention, and therefore there's nothing that you can do about it, and so I can just talk at you. So I've played a fair few number of characters as a player. I've played a range of different kind of races and classes. So my first ever character was an Aarakocra bard. His name was Cass, very much inspired from Breath of the Wild, because I'm a huge Breath of the Wild fan. And he died tragically in a fire. So we won't talk anymore about Cass. But I've cycled through a fair different styles of characters, different personalities. They do different things. They have different backstories. In particular, one of my favorite characters is the third character along. Her name is Goose, and she's a warlock. But her warlock's backstory is more interesting than the character's backstory. So if you are interested, please ask me about Goose's patron's backstory, because it makes me giggle every time I think about it. So I played a total of kind of like 6 characters, plus another one that I'm currently playing at the moment. And the thing that really struck me thinking about my experiences as a role-playing player, it's kind of standard practice or something that we notice as a pattern a lot is that when people play a role-playing game, usually their first character or the first couple of characters are just them, but skinned in the D&D norms and ideas. None of these 6 characters, I would say, are anything like me. Cass is taken straight from just Breath of the Wild. My second character was just I needed to come up with something because Cass died. Yeah, Goose again, like I was more invested in her patron's backstory than her backstory. And so all these characters are kind of just like I usually just silly gimmicks, and I would just come up with something, but none of them really felt like they said something about me until I met this character or I made this character. And this is my 7th character, and this is the only character I would say truly reflects and says something about who I am as a person and has taught me about things about who I am as a person. And her name is Jacqueline Frost, or also known as Jack Frost. So again, she was also kind of designed as this troll character. She was just like a rip-off of Jack Frost from the Rise of the Guardians movie. She's a very overpowered trickery domain cleric. But she's the most like me of any character that I've ever made. And so it became interesting to me, like, okay, why is that? Why did it take me 7 tries? And what is it about her specifically that makes me reflect on aspects of myself? So there you go. There you can see the likeness. Um, so I think there's a couple of things we can point to that make us very similar and very different. So the important things I think to point out that are like wildly different are Jack is a changeling, so she can change her appearance at will and look like anyone she wants to look like. I am a human and I'm unfortunately bound to the body that I have and cannot change it without having radical and almost irreversible changes to my body. Um, Jack is also a cleric. I'm chronically unemployed, unfortunately, as hard as I try. Well, even if we take into consideration, what I do for a living as a philosopher, it's not quite the same as being a cleric. Cleric isn't really a role that I can take up within the society that I live in. It's also not a role that I've been like socialized to understand as a role within our world. We don't tend to have clerics in Scotland in 2023, although that would be very cool. And I think the other thing that's kind of important is also that Jack is magical. I cannot, as much as I would like to, produce magical flames. Despite all of this, we have a significant amount in common. So we're both sisters. Jack is an orphan as part of a church that worships a particular kind of fae goddess, and they take care of like a bunch of other orphans, and so she considers these other children like her brothers and sisters. So we're also sisters, and we've also cared for someone that's disabled. So Jack, one of Jack's sisters, is she takes care of her, and she's disabled. We have both experienced kind of like being in a low socioeconomic group. So Jack is obviously growing up without any kind of like parents, roams the streets and just robs people and then gives the money to the poor. She's kind of like a Robin Hood figure. And I've had kind of like similar kind of like experiences of living in a kind of like low economics household. And we're both very cheeky, and maybe also a bit left wing. The fact that she is also kind of like inclined to um, redistribute wealth where she sees fit is not dissimilar from my own kind of like political inclinations. In that sense, that there's a nice amount of overlap in our kind of outlook there. So given that there's like these vast differences in terms of like there are certain things that I just cannot experience, like being a magic user that is fundamental to who Jack is as a person, and yet we have these kind of like cornerstones of aspects of our personality that are similar. How do I learn from Jack and how do I learn about myself? And I want to say that there are kind of like radical norms that maybe I couldn't know what it's like to, I couldn't really know what it's like to be a magic user. But I say, actually, why are these norms so different? Are they really so different? Are they translatable in a relevant sense? And so what I want to say is that role playing involves, and this is kind of like probably the only piece of technical terminology that I want to use. I don't want to kind of like bog this down with too much philosophical gunk. But I think role playing involves something called folk psychological concepts. And these are kind of like concepts or types or ideas we use around categorizing people. So cleric is a folk psychological concept. It's a term for someone's job. Someone is a cleric. A sister is another kind of folk psychological concept. It describes some kind of like social role I have to other people. And these comes with kind of embedded norms about how we should behave. Clerics and sisters behave in particular ways. Clerics will heal the sick. They will pay homage to their gods. Sisters will steal the makeup of their sibling or steal the clothes of their sibling. Thinking about my own relationship with my sister. And so I think there are overlapping norms there, or ways to translate these norms between the fantasy and the real world, where we can see that they have overlap. And it's through these enacting of certain norms that this self-understanding happens. So I'm kind of stealing this a little bit from the mind-shaping literature, but yeah, I don't want to get too bogged down in the philosophical jargon. So I think because role-playing games involve different kinds of categories of people that are radically different from, say, our real world categories. These categories nevertheless come with like all of these expectations about how one should act. So the barbarian is always the one who knocks down the door rather than tries to pick the lock. The cleric is the one who heals the party. The rogue is the one that's always kind of like trying to sneak around. And these have a similar structure to the way that these categories work in our world. So our categories also come with norms about how someone should behave as a sister, as a philosopher, as a D&D player. And these norms are important because they determine when it's appropriate to use them. So it's appropriate to use the term sister in a particular circumstance. There are certain kind of like rules implicit to the idea of sister that come into play. It would be weird to apply the term sister to someone who, say, didn't identify as a woman or didn't have any siblings. And so I think what these norms are doing is they're kind of like guiding our actions in certain ways. So because the term sister applies to me, and that comes with certain rules about who that applies to and what they should do, they kind of guide my action in a certain extent. So because I am a sister, I have to act in a certain way towards my sibling, usually being nice to her, although not always the case. And that's different from the way that I would act with my friend, that I would act with my partner, with my parents. And so in that way, the norms are kind of like constraining. But I also kind of want to make the argue that these norms are kind of enabling in the role-playing way. So when we have cases of self-understanding, or we understand better who we are as people, we're applying those kinds of norms to ourselves. So I take this idea of a sister and all of the kind of expectations and rules that come with it, and I apply it to myself, and I act in sister-like ways. And so therefore I come to understand myself as a sister, because I kind of like project this role onto myself and conform to it. And so I can do the same with the fantasy roles as well. Like there is something to be that is a cleric, and therefore if I understand myself as a cleric, it's because I'm acting like one. And this allows me to learn and create a deeper understanding of myself through these kinds of like structural overlaps. And so for example, the fact that, the cleric has certain rules to which like they should conform to makes me then, and in conforming to them, I understand my own limitations, but I also understand like, oh, that's what it's like to oh, okay, I'm almost done. That's what it's like to be a cleric. Now I understand because I'm acting like one. And so these overlaps, they're not incomprehensible, they're not completely wildly out of our realm of understanding. They are significantly similar to our own. And therefore I kind of want to say that these fantasy norms and these fantasy categories, even though they may seem fantastical, they're not as widely different from our own. So yeah, I will kind of skip the summary because hopefully the point is clear. Fingers crossed. But yeah, thank you all for listening. Yeah.